The whole town laughed when she dug into the frozen hillside. And now they know why. A grieving widow arrived in Bismarck with her little boy and nothing but a wagon, a shovel, and one desperate idea. But when an old veteran in a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket showed up with his loyal German shepherd, everything changed. Together, they built a strange arched mud house, half buried in the earth. The kind of shelter people called a dirt grave.
You really think you're
instead
going
of
to
a home.
survive the winter in that ditch?
Then the first real blizzard hit. 3 days of screaming wind, snow piling high enough to swallow fences, cabins cracking, fires dying. And suddenly, the only place that stayed warm and dry was the house everyone mocked. What happened next would humble an entire town and turn one forgotten veteran into the winter hero nobody saw coming. Before we jump in, tell us where you're watching from.
That's it.
Drop your city, state, or country in
Margaret,
the comments
the rope.
below.
Now,
I love seeing how far these stories reach. Winter came early to the outskirts of Bismarck, North Dakota. And the wind moved across the prairie like a blade, looking for skin. Margaret Harris stood beside her wagon on a slight rise of frozen grass. The horizon stretched wide and empty, and for a moment, she felt the world had been scraped clean of everything gentle. She was 31, with a face that still held the softness of youth but carried a new sharpness around the mouth, as if grief had tightened the edges. Her hair, once carefully pinned and curled in the city, was now pulled into a practical knot beneath a faded wool scarf. Her skin had the pale look of someone who had spent too many nights awake and too many mornings swallowing fear instead of breakfast. The hem of her coat was dusty from travel. Her gloves were worn thin, and her eyes, gray-blue, watchful, kept scanning the land like a person searching for a door in a wall that had no openings. Behind her, the wagon creaked softly in the wind, loaded with what little she owned. A small chest of clothes, a sack of flour, a cast-iron Dutch oven, a bundle of canvas, a few boards she'd bought with money she couldn't afford to spend, and a set of tools that looked too heavy for someone with her narrow shoulders. And beside her stood Ethan, her son, 8 years old and too quiet for his age, with a thin frame that made his coat hang on him like it belonged to someone else. He had brown hair that refused to lie flat no matter how many times she smoothed it, and large eyes that seemed to take in everything and trust nothing. He held himself like a child who had learned the world could change overnight and didn't want to be caught unready when it happened again. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other, staring out at the prairie as if the emptiness had offended him personally. "Mama," he said, voice small but careful, like he was afraid the wind might steal his words. "There aren't any trees." Margaret followed his gaze, and her stomach tightened. He was right. There were no forests, no thick lines of timber, no comforting dark shapes rising against the sky. Just rolling grassland frozen stiff, patched with snow, and in the far distance a thin ribbon of cottonwoods near a creek that looked like a rumor more than a resource. In St. Louis, even the poor streets had wood porches, fences, crates, barrels, old boards leaning against alleys like forgotten bones. Here, wood was not something you tripped over. It was something you hunted for. And winter was not a season here. It was a judge. She swallowed, tasting cold air and the bitter memory of the city she'd left behind. St. Louis had been crowded and loud and sick with summer heat. And then the cholera came through like a thief with a clean knife. Her husband, James Harris, had been a carpenter with hands that could turn raw wood into shelter. But he couldn't build a wall against disease. 6 months ago, he had been laughing at their table, promising Ethan he'd make him a toy boat by spring. 3 days later, he was gone, and Margaret learned how quickly a home could become a hollow thing. She remembered the sound of the church floor under her knees, the way her hands shook when she tried to fold his shirt for the last time. The way Ethan had stared at the coffin, like he expected his father to sit up and apologize for the inconvenience. After the funeral, people offered sympathy in the same tone they offered leftovers, polite, brief, and meant to be forgotten. A widow in the city was a woman standing on a trap door. The rent didn't care about grief, the streets didn't care about motherhood, and the future didn't care that she was tired. So she did what desperate people have always done. She chose the unknown, because the known had already killed her once. She had saved $200 over 5 years by sewing for richer women, mending hems, patching coats, and saying "yes, ma'am," until her jaw ached. Every coin had been a small act of rebellion. Every stitch had been a step away. When the land office offered 40 acres outside Bismarck, she took it like a gambler takes a final card. Now she stood on it, and the prairie stared back without warmth or mercy. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, and she looked down at him, forcing her face to soften. He had freckles across his nose that made him look younger than he acted, and his lips were chapped from the journey. His hands were tucked into his coat pockets, but his shoulders were still hunched against the cold. "We can't build a house," he whispered, as if saying it too loud might make it true forever. Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to lie. She wanted to say, "Of course we can, sweetheart," because mothers are supposed to be miracles in human form. But she had promised herself she wouldn't raise him on sweet words that collapsed under pressure. She turned slowly, letting him see her think, letting him see that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep moving while fear screamed. "We can build," she said carefully, "but not the kind everyone expects." Ethan frowned, his eyebrows pulling together the way James used to when he tried to understand a tricky piece of work. "What kind?" Margaret glanced back at the wagon. Under the canvas and flour sack was her most precious possession, a small worn booklet she'd found months ago in a boarding house, left behind by some surveyor or railroad man. The cover was cracked, the pages smelled faintly of smoke, and the drawings inside were rough. But the words had lit a strange fire in her mind during the long journey west. She pulled it out now, her fingers stiff in the cold, and opened it to a page she had studied until she could see it with her eyes closed. There were sketches of shelters, built where timber was scarce half-buried structures shaped like tunnels, curved roofs made from bent ribs, walls packed with earth and sod. The notes were blunt and practical. An arch distributes weight, earth holds heat, a low ceiling warms faster, a hillside is a gift, if you know how to use it. Margaret had read those lines the way starving people read recipes. She showed Ethan the sketch. He leaned in, eyes narrowing. "It looks like a hole," he said. Margaret almost laughed, and the sound surprised her, like a bird she didn't know was still alive in her chest. "It's not a hole," she said, though she understood why he thought it was. "It's a shelter, an arch house. We build into the ground. The earth keeps us warmer. The roof curves so the snow slides off instead of crushing it." Ethan stared at the drawing longer. "Will it work?" he asked. And the question under the question was the one that made her heart thud painfully. "Will we live?" Margaret looked past him, past the wagon, past the Pale Creek line, and into the wind that seemed determined to erase them. She remembered the city's sickness, her husband's final breath, the way Ethan had gone quiet afterward, like someone turning down the volume on his own childhood. She remembered how helpless she had felt then. Here, helplessness would not be a tragedy. It would be a death sentence. So she chose certainty, even if she had to forge it with her own hands. "Yes," she said, with a steadiness she didn't fully feel yet. "It will work." She made herself walk, step by step, toward a gentle slope near the creek because the book had said south-facing ground would drink winter sun, and because the creek meant water, and because the slight rise would let her dig without fighting a flood. She paced the area, counting steps, measuring with her eyes the way James had taught her, always look twice before you cut once. She imagined the space. 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep. The back half dug into the hillside, the front half rising like a curved animal's spine. She pictured Ethan sleeping inside, warm enough to dream again. The thought was so powerful, it made her hands stop shaking. "We start today," she told him. Ethan's mouth opened as if to protest, but then he looked at the wind, at the empty land, at his mother's face, and he nodded like a small soldier receiving orders. They unpacked the shovel and pickaxe, and Margaret set the first mark in the prairie sod. The ground was stubborn, thick with roots that had held this land together for centuries. She drove the shovel down and felt it hit resistance like a dull thud in her bones. She leaned her weight into it, arms trembling, and pried up a block of sod heavy as a stone. The cold bit her fingers even through gloves. The sod came up in a rough rectangle, and she realized immediately why people used it like bricks, because it was already a building material, shaped by nature and packed tight. She lifted it, staggered a step, and set it aside. Ethan hurried over and tried to lift the next one. He grunted, face turning red, and Margaret almost told him to stop. But then she saw the stubborn set of his jaw, the way he refused to look at her for permission. He was not playing at being brave. He was becoming it. "Slide it," she instructed softly, changing the task so he could succeed without feeling small. "Don't lift. Drag it like a sled." Ethan nodded and did it, pulling the block over the grass with both hands, breathing hard but not complaining. Hours passed in the pale daylight. Margaret's shoulders burned, her palms blistered, and the muscles in her back felt like rope being twisted too tight. Still, she kept digging. She didn't allow herself the luxury of imagining failure. Each scoop of earth was a sentence written against death. Each sod block stacked beside the hole was a promise made visible. And as the sun began to lower, she noticed something that made her pause. The air inside the excavation, only a few feet deep, was calmer, less sharp. The wind didn't cut as viciously down there. The ground itself seemed to hold a gentler temperature, as if the earth had its own secret warmth that it shared only with those who dared to come close. Margaret climbed down into the hole and stood still, letting the difference wrap around her like a thin blanket. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since James died, she felt something close to relief. Not happiness, not peace, but a small opening in the wall of fear. Ethan stood at the edge looking down at her. "It's warmer," he said, surprised. Margaret opened her eyes and looked up at him. The sky above was already turning the color of iron. The wind was still cruel, still hungry, but the earth beneath her feet felt steady, ancient, and indifferent to the storm's threats. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like prayer. That's the point. When evening finally forced them back to the wagon, Margaret's body ached so deeply she could barely climb in. Ethan curled under a blanket, his breath puffing in the cold air. And for a moment he looked like he had when he was 5, small, soft, and unaware of how hard the world could be. Margaret stared out at the dark prairie, listening to the wind scrape at the wagon boards. And she thought of the people back in St. Louis who would have called her foolish. She thought of the neighbors she hadn't met yet, who would surely laugh when they saw her digging into the hillside like a badger. She thought of winter coming like a giant with a white cloak and no pity. And then she thought of the warmth in the hole, the promise hidden beneath the surface. and she felt something rise in her chest that wasn't hope exactly, but the raw, stubborn decision to keep going. She reached for the little booklet again, tracing the sketch of the arch with her fingertip. "Innovation isn't having everything," she murmured into the darkness, speaking to herself as much as to James's memory. "It's using what you have." Ethan's sleepy voice floated from the blanket. "Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "When we finish, can we call it our house?" Margaret's eyes burned, and she blinked hard so he wouldn't hear it in her voice. "Yes," she said. "We'll call it home." Outside, the prairie wind howled like laughter from the mouth of a cold god, but inside the wagon, a widow and her child held onto a plan shaped like an arch, curved, stubborn, and built to endure. The next morning, the prairie looked even more unforgiving. A pale sheet of frost stretched tight across the land, as if the world had been wrapped in glass. Margaret Harris stepped out of the wagon before the sun had fully risen, her breath coming in small white clouds that vanished the moment they formed. Her hands were stiff from yesterday's work, and when she flexed her fingers, pain flickered through her knuckles like tiny sparks. She didn't have the luxury of warming up slowly. Winter wasn't patient, and the wind had already started its daily sermon whistling through the grass, promising that anything weak would be taken. Ethan climbed down behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his thin shoulders hunched inside his oversized coat. He looked toward the excavation with a cautious hope, like a child approaching a fire he wasn't sure would stay lit. Margaret gave him a small nod, not the kind meant to comfort, but the kind meant to command courage. Then she went back to work. The shovel bit into the prairie sod with a sound like tearing cloth, and she lifted another block of earth, heavy and stubborn, its roots clinging together as if the land itself didn't want to be rearranged. She stacked the sod carefully beside the pit, building a rough wall of green-brown bricks. Each block felt like 30 pounds of resistance, and after the first hour, her back burned so sharply she had to stop and press her palm against her spine, breathing through her teeth. The blisters on her palms had split during the night, and now the cold air made them sting like salt in a wound. Still, she dug. She dug because the earth was warmer below, because Ethan had smiled yesterday when he felt that hidden warmth, and because she could not bear the thought of him learning that promises were just words that failed when the wind rose. She measured the space again as she deepened it, keeping the rectangle true 12 feet wide, 16 deep, like she was carving out a room in the ribs of the world. Ethan dragged sod blocks as she had taught him, sliding them across the grass with both hands. He moved with the quiet focus of a boy who had watched death too closely and decided he hated being powerless. He didn't complain, but Margaret saw his small fingers turning red, the way he stopped to blow into them, the way his lips tightened when he tried not to show how cold he was. "Take breaks," she told him. "Short ones. Don't go numb." Ethan nodded without arguing, which worried her more than any protest would have. Children should argue. Silence was something grief taught. By mid-morning, the excavation was deep enough that the wind felt less cruel inside it, and Margaret worked from below, tossing dirt up to the surface. The hole was no longer a shallow cut. It was beginning to look like a place that might hold a life. That was when the first neighbor arrived. Margaret heard the sound before she saw the man boots crunching on frozen grass, the slow pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. She straightened and turned, shovel in hand, and saw a figure standing at the edge of her property line as if he owned the view. His name, she would learn, was Calvin Rourke. A man in his late 40s with a broad belly and a face shaped by years of chewing tobacco and easy judgment. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his mustache was thick and yellowed at the edges, giving him the look of a fox that had learned to talk. He wore a heavy wool coat and a fur hat pulled low, and his eyes held the smug comfort of someone who had never had to start over with nothing. He didn't greet her like a neighbor. He inspected her like a mistake. "Well now," Calvin called down into the pit, voice loud enough to carry across the prairie. "What in God's name are you doing down there, ma'am?" Margaret's jaw tightened. She hated how small she must look from his angle, like a woman already buried. "Building," she answered simply, keeping her voice flat. Calvin chuckled, the sound rolling out of him like a barrel being tipped. "Building?" he repeated, as if the word itself was entertainment. "That ain't building. That's digging. Folks dig holes for two reasons out here: to plant something or to bury something." His laughter was joined by another voice behind him, lighter and sharper, like a knife trying to sound friendly. A woman stepped forward, wrapped in a gray shawl, her face pinched by cold and suspicion. Her name was Loretta Vance, maybe 35, with pale skin that looked almost bluish in winter light, and hair the color of dry wheat tucked under her bonnet. She had the posture of someone who spent her life watching other people and measuring herself against them. "You poor thing," Loretta called, not sounding poor herself. "Did you lose your mind on the trail? There's no such thing as a house under the ground." Margaret felt Ethan climb down into the pit beside her, his eyes wide, his hands clenched into fists. She wanted to pull him behind her, but she also wanted him to see something important. That cruelty was often delivered with laughter, and that surviving meant not letting it steer you. She lifted another shovel of dirt and tossed it aside, refusing to stop working just because they wanted a show. "It's not under the ground," Margaret said. "It's into the ground. There's a difference." Calvin leaned forward, squinting like he could force sense into her with his eyes. "You got no timber," he said. "No husband, no brothers, just you and that little boy. You can't build a cabin, so you're trying to make a molehill into a home." Loretta covered her mouth as if she was trying to hide a smile, but it escaped anyway. Margaret felt heat rise in her face, not from embarrassment, but from anger, the kind that burned clean. For a second, she imagined hurling the shovel at Calvin's smug face, imagined the satisfying shock of silence afterward. But then she looked at Ethan. He was watching her, searching her expression the way he had watched doctors' faces back in St. Louis, trying to read whether the news would be good or bad. And she understood something sharp and sacred. If she lost control now, he would learn that fear and humiliation could control her. She would not hand him that lesson. She kept her hand steady on the shovel handle. "You're welcome to keep walking," she said. "The wind will entertain you elsewhere." Calvin snorted. "Suit yourself. Just don't come crying when the first snow caves in that little dirt coffin." Loretta added, almost kindly, "There's a church in town. They might help you find a proper place, a family to take you in." Margaret's stomach twisted at the thought of charity that came with strings, of being looked at like a helpless thing to be stored away. "No," she said quietly. "Thank you." Calvin spat into the grass and turned away. Loretta followed, and their footsteps faded. But the cold they left behind stayed. Margaret kept digging until her arms trembled and her vision blurred. By afternoon, more people passed at a distance, drawn by curiosity the way crows were drawn by anything unusual. Some stared and whispered. Some laughed openly. A teenage boy, freckle-faced, lanky, with a red scarf, shouted, "Hey, lady, you gonna pop out like a prairie dog when spring comes?" His friends roared. Margaret didn't look up. She didn't give them her eyes. She gave them only the sound of work. That evening, when the light began to fail, Margaret climbed out of the pit and stood beside the stacked sod blocks. Her body felt like it had been beaten, her muscles twitching with exhaustion. Ethan stood near the wagon, holding a tin cup of water he'd fetched from the creek. His cheeks were wind-burned, and his eyelashes had tiny crystals of frost clinging to them. "They were mean," he said, voice low. Margaret took the cup, drank, and handed it back. "Mean doesn't keep you warm," she replied. Ethan looked down, then back up. "Are we really building a house?" Margaret stared at the excavation, at the beginning of something that looked too fragile to fight winter. The hole was deeper now, the back half tucked into the hillside like the earth was slowly accepting her plan. Still, doubt crept in the way cold crept into bones. She thought of Calvin's words, "dirt coffin." She thought of Loretta's pity, sharp as ice. She thought of the way people in St. Louis had looked at her after James died, as if her future had been buried with him. Her throat tightened, and she forced herself to breathe. "Yes," she said. But the word tasted different now, heavier, more expensive, more. That night, inside the wagon, the wind slapped the canvas like an angry hand. Margaret lay beside Ethan, listening to it, staring at the darkness above them. Every creak of the wagon sounded like a warning. Ethan fell asleep quickly, worn out from work and cold. But Margaret stayed awake, her mind racing like a trapped animal. She imagined snow piling up, imagined the roof she hadn't built yet, imagined her hands failing before the structure was complete. She imagined Ethan sick with cold, his small body shivering the way James's had shivered with fever. The thought made her chest ache so sharply she had to sit up. She pressed her forehead against the wooden side of the wagon, breathing slowly, trying to control the panic that wanted to rise. In the city, fear had been loud and chaotic sirens, sickness, funerals. Out here, fear was quiet. It sounded like wind. It felt like time running out. She reached into her coat and pulled out the little surveyor's booklet again, flipping to the sketch of the arched shelter. Her fingers traced the curved roofline. The arch, the notes had said, was stronger than a flat span. Curved strength. Margaret stared at that phrase until it felt like it was speaking to her directly. Maybe that was the real lesson hidden in the drawing. Straight lines broke under pressure. Curves endured. She closed her eyes and pictured the shelter finished, half buried. The roof rounded like a sleeping animal. The sod laid thick on top. The inside warm enough to keep a fire alive. She pictured Ethan's face relaxed, no longer pinched with worry. She pictured herself standing at the door, not as a woman begging for mercy, but as a woman who had carved safety from the earth with her own hands. Her throat burned, and she realized she was crying silently, not from weakness, but from the brutal tenderness of wanting something to live. She wiped her face quickly, as if the wind might see. Then she whispered into the darkness, to James's memory, to the prairie, to whatever listened out here. "I'm not digging a grave. I'm digging a chance." Outside, the wind answered with a howl that sounded almost like laughter. But Margaret no longer cared. Let them laugh. Let the whole prairie laugh. She would keep digging until the earth itself admitted she belonged. The morning after the laughter, the prairie woke up colder, as if the land had heard every cruel word and decided to repeat them in frost. Margaret Harris climbed down into the excavation with her shovel, before the sun could pretend it was warm, her breath turning to pale smoke that the wind tore apart. The hole was deeper now, and the earth around her felt calmer than the surface still cold, but steady, like a stern old guardian that didn't waste energy on cruelty. Above her, Ethan worked in silence, dragging sod blocks and stacking them into neat piles, his small hands red and raw, his face set in that careful seriousness that had arrived after his father died. Margaret tried not to look at his fingers too long, because guilt was a kind of luxury too. If she let guilt win, she would stop. If she stopped, winter would finish what grief had started. She had just lifted another heavy block of sod when she heard footsteps that didn't rush, didn't hesitate, didn't circle like curious neighbors. These steps were steady, deliberate, and accompanied by a soft, rhythmic sound like claws tapping on frozen ground. Margaret froze. Her body remembered the city, remembered strangers, remembered danger. She turned, shovel raised slightly, not threatening yet, but ready. A figure stood at the edge of the pit, framed against the pale sky as if he had stepped out of an old photograph. He was an older man, somewhere in his late 60s, tall but lean, the kind of lean that comes from years of labor and not enough rest. His face was angular, carved by wind and time, with high cheekbones and a jaw that looked like it had once clenched through worse things than cold. A short beard, mostly gray with streaks of darker hair, covered his chin and jawline, trimmed close like a man who didn't have patience for fuss. His eyes were a pale hazel, sharp and steady, and they held the distant focus of someone who had watched too many horizons for threats. But there was no mockery in them, no entertainment, only assessment, the way a craftsman studies a structure before touching it. He wore a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, heavy enough to look like armor, the pattern bold against the snow like a warning flag that refused to be ignored. The jacket sat broad across his shoulders, faded at the cuffs, patched once near the elbow. Under it, he had a dark wool shirt and work pants tucked into boots that had clearly walked through more winters than most people could name. A knit cap covered his hair, but gray curls escaped at the edges. Beside him stood a German Shepherd Large, about 5 years old by the look of his strong frame and confident stance. The dog's coat was thick and healthy, sable and black with a proud dark saddle across his back, and his ears were upright like spears. His eyes were intelligent and calm, the kind of gaze that didn't panic, didn't fawn, just watched and decided. He stood close to the man without leaning, disciplined but affectionate in a way that felt earned. Margaret noticed the dog's paws, first big, steady, built for snow, and then the way his chest rose and fell with controlled breathing, as if even his lungs were trained. "Morning," the man said, voice low and rough, like gravel warmed by a fire. It wasn't friendly in the cheerful sense. It was respectful. He didn't shout down at her like Calvin had. He didn't speak with pity like Loretta. He simply spoke as one human to another. Margaret didn't lower the shovel. "Morning," she answered carefully. Ethan appeared beside the man at the edge, staring up with cautious curiosity, his eyes flicking between the stranger and the dog. The German shepherd turned his head toward Ethan and gave a quiet huff, almost like a greeting, then looked back to Margaret, as if to say, "We're not here to harm." The man's gaze dropped to the excavation, then to the stacked sod blocks, then to the booklet Margaret had tucked into her coat pocket. He saw more than most people would have seen. He saw intent. He saw design. He saw survival. "You're building an earth-bermed arch shelter," he said. Not a question, a statement. The words hit Margaret like a sudden warmth. It wasn't just that he understood. It was that he spoke the idea out loud like it was real, like it was valid, like she wasn't insane for trying. Margaret blinked, throat tight. "Yes," she said. "I am." The man nodded once, slow. "It'll hold," he said, "if you do it right." Ethan's mouth fell open slightly. Margaret's hands tightened on the shovel handle. "You've seen one before?" she asked, forcing herself to sound steady. The man's eyes shifted, and for a brief moment something darker passed behind them, something old and heavy. "Built one," he replied. "Long time ago. When I came back from the war and didn't have much of anything except stubbornness." He paused, then added, "Name's Walter Bennett." He didn't offer his hand from that distance. He didn't rush closeness. He stood as if he understood boundaries were sacred on the frontier. Margaret swallowed. "Margaret Harris," she said. "And this is my son, Ethan." Walter looked at Ethan then. Really looked. Not the way adults often glanced at children like they were background. He studied the boy's posture, the quiet watchfulness, the way Ethan held his shoulders too tight. Walter's expression softened by a fraction, and Margaret saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. Not of Ethan's face, but of the weight he carried. "8?" Walter asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." Walter gave a small grunt that might have been approval. "Old enough to learn," he said. "Young enough to still believe hard work means something." Margaret didn't know whether to feel comforted or wounded by that. Then Walter's German shepherd stepped forward, careful, not invading. The dog's nose lifted slightly, catching Margaret's scent. Then he sat down neatly beside Ethan like a soldier, waiting for orders. Ethan stared, frozen at first, then slowly reached out a hand. The dog didn't flinch. He simply allowed it, eyes steady, ears forward. Ethan's fingers touched the thick fur at the dog's neck, and his face changed, just a little. The tightness eased. A small breath left him, like he'd been holding it for months. "What's his name?" Ethan whispered. Walter glanced down at the dog, and for the first time, a hint of humor touched his mouth. "Duke," he said, "because he acts like he owns every inch of ground he stands on." Duke's tail thumped once against the frozen grass, as if he agreed with the title. Ethan's lips twitched, almost a smile. Margaret felt something in her chest loosen, and it scared her how much she wanted to trust this moment. Trust was dangerous. Trust was how people got hurt twice. Walter's gaze returned to Margaret. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "South-facing slope. Close enough to water. Sod blocks stacked clean. You've got sense." Margaret's pride rose, hot and protective. "I'm doing what I have to," she answered. Walter nodded again, as if that was the only answer that mattered. He crouched near the edge of the pit, careful not to crumble the soil. His knees cracked faintly, and Margaret saw the way he moved, controlled, but with the stiffness of old injuries. War injuries, she thought, or work injuries. Sometimes those were the same. Walter pointed at the excavation's back wall. "You've dug far enough to get the earth's warmth," he said. "But you need to start thinking roof ribs soon. The ground will freeze deeper in a week or two. Once it does, you'll be fighting stone." Margaret's stomach sank. She already knew time was running out, but hearing it from someone else made it sharper. "I don't have enough timber," she admitted, hating how vulnerable it sounded. Walter's eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in calculation. "You don't need much," he said. "That's the whole point of an arch. Curve does what brute strength can't." He tapped the air with one finger, tracing an invisible half-circle. "A flat roof needs heavy beams. An arch spreads the load. Snow presses down, but the weight travels along the curve and into the ground." His voice was steady, almost instructional, like a man teaching someone how not to die. Margaret listened the way she used to listen to James when he explained joinery, and the familiarity of it hurt in a strange, tender way. Walter shifted his weight and looked toward the thin line of cottonwoods by the creek. "There's young timber there," he said. "Not big, but enough for ribs if you know how to bend it." Margaret stared at him. "I can't haul that alone," she said, already hearing Calvin's laughter in her head. Walter's mouth tightened and his beard moved slightly as he spoke. "You shouldn't have to," he replied. The words landed like a hammer. Margaret felt her pride flare. She had survived the city, survived the burial, survived the trail. She didn't want to be a woman who needed saving. But then she looked at Ethan's hands in Duke's fur, and she remembered the truth that mattered more than pride. Ethan needed warmth more than he needed a heroic mother. Walter stood up again, tall against the wind. "I can help you," he said simply. "No payment, no favors, no sermons. Just help." Margaret's throat tightened. "Why?" she asked, sharper than she intended. Walter's eyes didn't blink. "Because I know what it looks like," he said. "When someone's building with their last bit of strength." He paused, and the wind filled the space between them. "And because I've been the fool people laughed at, too." Margaret studied him, searching for the catch. Men didn't offer help for nothing, not in cities, not in stories. But Walter didn't look like a man hunting for control. He looked like a man who had already fought the battle of ego and lost it on purpose. His flannel jacket snapped in the wind, and Margaret noticed the small details. A faded patch near the shoulder, a stitch line repaired by hand, a metal pin on the inside collar that might have once been military. The man had a past, a hard one, and something in that past had carved out the part of him that could still offer kindness without asking for ownership. Ethan looked up from Duke and finally spoke again. "Will Duke help too?" he asked, innocent and earnest. Walter exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. "Duke helps by making sure nobody sneaks up on us," he said. Duke's ears flicked as if he understood his job description. Margaret felt the corner of her mouth lift before she could stop it. It was small, barely there, but it was real. Walter noticed. He didn't comment. He simply nodded once more, like a man marking progress. "Tomorrow," Walter said. "Sunrise. We cut ribs and start shaping the arch. You keep digging today. Keep the back wall clean. And stack that sod like you've been doing. You've got good hands." Margaret's heart beat hard. Trust felt like stepping onto ice you couldn't test first. But she also felt something else beneath the fear. Relief. Thin as a thread, but strong enough to hold. She nodded. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Walter whistled softly, and Duke stood immediately, posture alert, ready to move. Before leaving, Walter looked down at Ethan. "Take care of your mother," he said, not in a sentimental way, but like a soldier assigning duty. Ethan straightened a little. "Yes, sir," he answered. Walter turned away then, boots crunching across frozen grass, Duke pacing beside him with calm authority. Margaret watched them go until they became smaller against the white horizon. When she finally looked down at her excavation again, it felt different. Not easier, not finished, but possible. She climbed back into the pit and lifted her shovel. The earth was still heavy. The wind was still cruel. The town would still laugh. But now Margaret had something she hadn't had yesterday. Proof that someone out here understood the shape of survival, and that curved strength like an arch, like a stubborn heart, could hold up under pressure when straight lines would snap. Sunrise arrived like a thin apology, pale and weak over the outskirts of Bismarck, and the prairie wind was already awake, prowling the grass as if it had a schedule. Margaret Harris stepped out of the wagon with her shoulders braced and her jaw set, the kind of posture a person wears when they know the day will hurt. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from an old linen sheet, a makeshift bandage to protect the blisters that had split open again. She could feel every bruise in her arms and back from the digging, but she also felt something new beneath the pain momentum. That rare and precious force that came when a plan stopped being a dream and started becoming wood and earth. Ethan stood beside her, still small in his coat, his cheeks wind-burned, but his eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. He looked toward the excavation like it was no longer a hole, but the beginning of a promise. When Walter Bennett appeared on the horizon, he came the way he had promised, steady, punctual, unbothered by the cold. He wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the pattern bold against the snow, and his lean frame moved with a disciplined stiffness that suggested old injuries kept him honest. His gray-streaked beard was dusted with frost, and his pale hazel eyes scanned the worksite like a builder measuring a future. Beside him paced Duke, the German shepherd, 5 years old and built like a winter machine broad chest, strong legs, thick sable coat with a dark saddle, ears up, gaze alert. Duke didn't bark at the wind. He watched it, as if he understood storms were not enemies you fought, but forces you outlasted. Walter carried a bundle of rope slung over one shoulder and a small hatchet at his belt. Over his other shoulder, he dragged something that made Margaret's heart lift. Several long, young cottonwood saplings, already cut and trimmed, flexible enough to bend, but strong enough to hold shape. "Morning," Walter said, voice low and rough. "You ready to stop digging and start building?" Margaret surprised herself by almost smiling. "More than ready," she replied. Ethan stepped forward, respectful but eager. "Good morning, sir," he said. Walter nodded at him, then looked down at Duke. "Stay close," Walter murmured. Duke's tail thumped once, and he trotted a circle around the excavation like a foreman inspecting a job site, sniffing the air, pausing to listen when the wind changed pitch. Walter crouched near the edge of the pit and pointed with a gloved hand. "We set ribs every 2 feet," he said. "Even spacing. Same curve, same depth on both ends. If you rush that part, the roof becomes a liar." Margaret swallowed. She had learned in the city that walls could lie pretty on the outside, rotten inside. She didn't want that kind of shelter. Walter showed them how to anchor the ends of the first sapling into shallow notches cut into the ground on either side of the excavation. He pressed the wood down until it bowed into a clean arch, then held it while Margaret drove stakes in to keep it from springing loose. Ethan steadied the middle of the rib with both hands, face tense with concentration, as if he were holding up the sky. "Don't fight the curve," Walter told him. "Let it become what it wants to be. That's how you get strength." Ethan nodded, absorbing the words like they were more than carpentry. The first rib stood, trembling slightly in the wind, but upright. The second rib went faster. Then the third. Soon the excavation wore a skeleton 7 ribs rising like the bones of a great buried animal. Margaret stood back for a moment, breath caught in her throat. It was no longer just dirt and desperation. It had shape. Walter began lashing cross pieces, thin branches laid horizontally across the ribs to stiffen them. His hands moved with practiced economy, knot after knot tight and sure. Margaret watched the way he worked. No wasted motion, no dramatic effort, just calm persistence. That kind of discipline didn't come from comfort. It came from surviving days when panic would have killed you faster than bullets. Ethan handed him rope and small branches, and Duke followed the boy closely, occasionally bumping his shoulder gently like a silent reminder to stay steady. At one point, a gust hit hard enough to rattle the ribs, and Ethan flinched. Duke immediately planted his paws wide and stared into the wind, ears sharp, body tense but controlled. Walter glanced at the dog and grunted. "He hates surprises," Walter said. "So do I." Margaret worked beside them, her fingers aching as she nailed and tied, but she felt strangely grateful for the pain. Pain meant she was doing something real. By midday, the frame was complete, and it arched over the excavated space like a tunnel carved from intention. Walter wiped his brow with the back of his glove, then nodded toward the wagon. "We eat," he said. "Then we cover it." Margaret warmed bread in the Dutch oven and poured water from a tin bucket. They sat on stacked sod blocks, the three of them, with Duke sitting at Ethan's feet like a guardian statue. Walter ate slowly, eyes scanning the sky as if he could read the weather like scripture. Margaret noticed the way he kept his back to the wind, instinctively, the way soldiers did. "You've done this before," she said quietly. Not as a question, but as an understanding. Walter's jaw tightened. "Not this exact shelter," he replied. "But I've built enough things in my life to know what holds and what fails." He didn't speak of the war directly, but it lived in the pauses between his words. Ethan, braver now, asked the question children ask when they sense a story, but don't know where it begins. "Were you really in a war?" Walter's eyes shifted to the horizon. For a moment his face looked carved from stone. Then he nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Long time ago. Came back with a body that creaks and a mind that doesn't always sleep." He glanced at Margaret, and his voice softened by a fraction. "Work helps. Keeps the ghosts busy." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She understood ghosts. She had her own. After the meal, Walter brought out Cedar Shake's thin shingles he'd split and bundled. Margaret stared at them, stunned. "Where did you get those?" she asked. Walter's mouth twitched, almost amused. "Made them last winter," he said. "Had more than I needed. Figured they'd be useful to someone who actually appreciates them." Margaret wanted to refuse out of pride, but she remembered the lesson she'd been forced to learn. Pride didn't insulate walls. "Thank you," she said simply. Walter nodded like that was enough. They began laying shingles over the curved ribs, starting low and working upward in overlapping rows. Walter explained the overlap, at least 2 inches, so water would shed cleanly. Margaret's hands moved carefully, measuring by eye, adjusting when needed. Ethan carried shingles and nails, learning the rhythm. Place, check, nail twice, move on. Duke trotted along the perimeter, occasionally stopping to sniff the air, then returning to sit near Ethan, as if the boy were the center of his assignment. The work took days. The sky shifted from pale to bruised, and the wind grew meaner. Each evening, Margaret's arms felt like they'd been filled with stones. But the roof grew stronger with every row. When the shingles finally covered the arch completely, the shelter looked like a giant, overturned boat half sunk into the hillside. Walter nodded with approval. "Now we seal it," he said. Margaret heated pine tar in an iron pot, the thick black substance smelling sharp and ancient. She painted it onto heavy canvas until the cloth darkened and stiffened. They stretched the tarred canvas over the shingles, fastening it down with wooden battens. The double layer felt like armor shingles to shed most water, canvas to catch whatever tried to sneak through. Finally came the sod, the same heavy blocks Margaret had cut while digging. They lifted them onto the roof one by one, laying them like bricks, thickest at the top, overlapping so water would run down and away. It was brutal work, the kind that made lungs burn and shoulders scream. Ethan's hands shook from cold, but he kept going, jaw clenched. Walter watched him once, then said quietly, That boy's got grit. Margaret's eyes stung. He shouldn't have to, she replied. Walter didn't argue. He simply kept lifting sod blocks, as if the only comfort he knew was finishing the job. Inside, Margaret plastered the earth walls with clay mixed with chopped straw, smoothing it until it sealed tight. The clay dried hard, turning the rough interior into something clean and solid. She built sleeping platforms along both side walls using boards balanced on sod supports. In the back corner, she stacked stones and packed clay between them, shaping a small fireplace. The chimney was a simple column of stones mortared with clay, rising through a carefully cut opening in the arch. When she lit the first fire, the smoke drew upward cleanly, and the warmth spread through the small space like mercy. The first night they slept inside, Margaret barred the door with a thick plank and listened. Outside, the wind howled, furious at being denied. Inside, the air held steady warmth. Ethan lay on his platform, fingers touching the clay wall as if he couldn't believe it was real. "It's warm, Mama," he whispered, and the words landed in Margaret's chest like a miracle she didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Walter stood near the fire, his flannel jacket glowing faintly in the firelight, and Duke lay at his feet, head up, eyes half-lidded but alert. Walter looked around the shelter with a builder's satisfaction. "This'll hold," he said softly. "This'll hold better than most folks' cabins." A week later, winter came to test that claim. The storm arrived like an angry god, 3 days of screaming wind and heavy snow that erased fences and swallowed roads. Margaret heard it begin at night, the first roar of wind hitting the shelter like a fist. She woke with her heart pounding, expecting collapse, expecting the roof to groan and fail. Ethan sat up too, eyes wide in the dim light. Duke lifted his head, ears sharp, and gave a low warning rumble, not fear, but awareness. Walter, sleeping near the fire, opened his eyes immediately, as if he'd never truly been asleep. He listened, calm as stone. The wind battered the sod-covered arch, but the shelter did not shudder the way the wagon had shuddered. The roof's curve guided the force up and over, and the snow that piled on top became a thick blanket instead of a crushing weight. The earth around them held the heat from the fire, releasing it slowly. So even when the flames died low, the air stayed livable. Margaret sat in the dim glow, stunned by the steadiness. She had spent months waiting for the world to break her again. But here, in this curved earthen womb of a home, the storm could scream all it wanted. It couldn't reach them. On the third day, when the wind finally weakened and the silence returned like a tired animal, Margaret opened the door and saw the prairie transformed. White drifts piled high, the world smoothed into a harsh beauty. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from other cabins, thin and desperate. Some roofs sagged. Some fences were gone. People had survived, but barely. Margaret turned back inside, looking at the clay walls, the warm platforms, the steady ashes of the fire. Walter sat by the hearth, rubbing Duke's ears absently, his face lit by quiet satisfaction. He glanced up at her and gave a small, almost invisible smile. "Funny thing about life," he said, voice low. "The thing they mocked first is usually the thing that saves you first." Margaret stared at him, and for the first time since James died, she felt the weight on her chest shift, not gone, not healed, but lighter. She looked at Ethan, who was smiling openly now, and she realized the shelter had done more than keep out cold. It had kept out despair. The storm left behind a silence so deep it felt unnatural, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath after 3 days of screaming. Morning light spilled over the snowdrifts in Bismarck like pale gold poured on a graveyard of fences and half-buried wagons. Margaret Harris opened her door slowly, expecting the world to lunge at her again, expecting some new cruelty waiting on the other side. Instead, she found the Earth Arch shelter standing the way it had stood through the worst of it, quiet, rounded, patient, its sod roof capped with white like a sleeping hill wearing a winter crown. The air outside still bit her cheeks, but she felt the strange power of knowing she could step back inside and survive. That knowledge was a kind of wealth she'd never owned before. Ethan came out behind her, wrapped in his coat, eyes wide with wonder at the transformed landscape. The boy's face looked softer today, less pinched by worry, and Margaret realized the storm had done something to him. It had proven that safety was not a fairy tale. It could be built. It could be earned. Walter Bennett stepped out next, his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket bright against the snow like a stubborn ember that refused to die. His beard was dusted with frost, and his lean face looked carved from weathered wood. But his eyes were calm, the way they always were when something tried to intimidate him. Duke followed, the German shepherd moving with quiet authority, paws sinking into the snow without hesitation, nose lifted as he read the air like a map. He paused at the edge of the shelter, ears forward, scanning the horizon as if he expected trouble to come crawling out of the white. Margaret watched the dog for a moment and thought, not for the first time, that Duke wasn't just loyal, he was disciplined. The kind of companion shaped by long days of loneliness and one man's need for order in a world that had taken too much. Walter's voice broke the silence. "They'll come today," he said, not sounding pleased or worried, just certain. Margaret's stomach tightened. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. Walter nodded toward the distant line of cabins barely visible across the snow. "The ones who laughed," he said. "Cold teaches humility faster than sermons do." Margaret felt her jaw clench. She remembered Calvin Rourke's voice calling her shelter a dirt coffin. She remembered Loretta Vance's thin pity, sharp as ice. She remembered the teenage boys shouting jokes like stones. She wanted to tell Walter they could stay away. She wanted to lock the door and let pride have its revenge. But then she looked at the prairie, how empty it was, how merciless, and she remembered something else too. Out here, survival wasn't a private victory. If your neighbor froze, the land didn't care. It would just take another body and move on. Ethan tugged her sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, pointing. Shapes were moving across the snow. People. Margaret's heart beat harder. The first to arrive was Loretta Vance. She walked carefully, lifting her skirt slightly to step over drifts, her gray shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her wheat-colored hair was tucked under her bonnet, and her face looked different now, still sharp, still watchful, but the smugness had cracked. Her lips were chapped from the storm, and her eyes had that tired shine of someone who had spent nights listening to wind scrape at their walls. Behind her came Calvin Rourke, his heavy coat pulled tight, his mustache stiff with frost, his broad face red and irritated by cold and pride. He didn't look like a man coming to apologize. He looked like a man coming because his options had run out. Two other neighbors followed at a distance, a young couple Margaret hadn't met before, Amos and Clara Wilkins. Amos was in his early 20s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with sandy hair sticking out from under a fur cap and a face that still carried boyish softness. Clara was about the same age, small and pale, her cheeks raw from cold, dark hair braided down her back. She held her arms around herself like she was trying to keep her bones from rattling. They walked close together, the way young love does when it's terrified. Loretta stopped first, clearing her throat. "Mrs. Harris," she said, voice careful. Margaret noticed she didn't say poor thing today. Calvin shifted his weight, eyes darting over the shelter with reluctant interest. Loretta swallowed, then added, We saw the storm didn't take your roof." Margaret kept her face neutral. "It didn't," she replied. Calvin grunted. "Lucky," he muttered, as if luck was the only explanation he could tolerate. Walter stepped forward slightly, not threatening, but present. His flannel jacket made him look like a walking warning sign. Duke sat beside him, posture straight, eyes locked on Calvin with calm suspicion. Calvin glanced at the dog and, for the first time, his bravado dimmed. Margaret saw it and almost smiled. Loretta's gaze moved to Ethan, who stood half behind his mother, but refused to hide completely. The boy's hands were stained faintly with clay and tar, proof of work. Loretta's voice softened. "My youngest coughed all night," she admitted. And Margaret heard the truth in it, fear, exhaustion, shame. "The wind came through our boards like knives." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. She didn't want to forgive them, but she didn't want their children to suffer either. Calvin cleared his throat, louder than necessary. "So," he said, "what is it you built? Some kind of dugout?" He said the word like it tasted wrong. Walter answered before Margaret could. "Earth-bermed arch shelter," he said calmly. "A roof that carries weight along the curve instead of fighting it. Sod on top for insulation, shingles and canvas underneath to keep it dry." Calvin squinted. "And you're saying that's warmer than a cabin?" Walter's eyes didn't blink. "I'm saying it stayed livable in a storm that shook your roof loose," he replied. The young man, Amos Wilkins, stepped forward then, his voice shaky but earnest. "Sir," he said to Walter, "we're new here. We didn't mean to bother anyone. We don't have enough timber. And after that storm, Clara." He glanced at his wife, and his face tightened with helplessness. "We can't do another week like that." Clara's lips trembled, and she looked at Margaret with something that wasn't mockery or pity, but raw need. Margaret's anger softened into something heavier, responsibility. She looked at Walter, searching his face for guidance. He gave a small nod, as if to say, "This is what the shelter was always going to become. Not just a roof, a lesson." Margaret exhaled slowly. "If you want to learn," she said, voice steady, "you'll have to work. This isn't a gift you can carry away. It's something you build." Calvin opened his mouth as if to complain. But Duke let out a single low bark, one clean warning note that snapped Calvin's attention shut. Ethan's eyes widened. Then he pressed his lips together to hide a grin. Walter's mouth twitched. Loretta nodded quickly. "We'll work," she said. "Tell us what to do." Margaret didn't invite them inside. Not yet. Trust didn't grow from words. It grew from effort. She led them around the shelter, pointing out the curve of the roof, the thickness of the sod, the way the entrance was built slightly recessed to block wind. Walter added small details with the precision of a man who respected craft. "Keep the ribs evenly spaced, 2 feet apart. If one rib leans, the whole roof learns to fail." He showed Amos how to lash rope tight, how to twist prairie grass into cord if rope ran short. He showed Calvin how to test the curve of a sapling before committing to it. And Calvin's face reddened when he realized the old veteran knew more than him without ever boasting. Ethan surprised everyone by speaking up. "The clay needs straw," he said, voice small but confident. "Or it cracks." Clara looked at him, startled. "You did the clay?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Mama taught me," he said. Margaret felt her throat tighten again. She hadn't realized how badly Ethan needed to feel useful. Walter glanced down at the boy with quiet approval, and Duke leaned his head gently against Ethan's leg, like a seal of agreement. Over the next hours, the group moved like a clumsy machine learning to function. Margaret drew in the snow with a stick at first, sketching the rectangle, the slope, the ribs. Then she brought out her worn booklet and began copying the idea onto paper scraps she'd saved from flour sacks and old letters. She wrote step by step in neat, careful handwriting. Choose a south-facing slope, dig into the hillside, stack sod, set ribs, shingle, tar canvas, sod roof, plaster walls, small chimney, keep it low, keep it tight, keep it dry. Walter corrected her when needed, not to control, but to strengthen. "Add this," he said, tapping her notes. "Double-layer roofing. Shingles alone can fail if wind drives snow sideways. Canvas buys you mercy." Margaret nodded, writing it down. Loretta watched her hands move and looked strangely humbled. Calvin hovered at the edge of the work, still proud, but quieter now. He cleared his throat and muttered, "Didn't think a woman would have the sense for this." Margaret looked up sharply, and Calvin flinched as if he expected a slap. Walter's voice came calm but cold. "Sense doesn't come from being a man," he said. "It comes from paying attention." Calvin swallowed and looked away. That afternoon, as more neighbors drifted closer, curious faces, cautious questions, Margaret realized something almost frightening. The shelter had become a beacon. Not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. The rumor moved faster than any horse could. "There's a dirt house out by the creek," people whispered. "Warmer than a cabin. Dry as a church floor." Margaret stood in the snow, her notes in her hand, and felt a strange, unfamiliar weight settle on her shoulders. She had come here to survive quietly, to hide from the world's cruelty, but the world had found her anyway. And now it wanted something from her. Not her money, not her body, not her obedience, but her knowledge. She looked at Walter, still standing tall in his flannel jacket, Duke at his side like a shadow made of loyalty. Walter's face remained unreadable, but his eyes held something that looked like peace. Maybe this was why he had helped her. Not for gratitude, not for romance, but because the frontier didn't reward pride. It rewarded adaptation. Margaret looked down at Ethan, who was showing Clara how to mix straw into clay with small, careful hands, and she understood the lesson forming in front of her. Survival was not only about strength, it was also about knowing when to accept help and knowing when to become the help. The prairie winds still cut cold, and winter still ruled the land. But now, standing among neighbors who had come with shame and left with purpose, Margaret felt the cold lose a little of its power, not because the weather had softened, but because the people had. In the end, the miracle was never just the house. It wasn't the sod roof or the curved ribs or the clay walls that held back the wind. The real miracle was what God placed inside a broken season. The strength to keep digging when the world laughed. The wisdom to accept help when pride wanted to freeze her heart. And the quiet mercy of a stranger who arrived at the exact moment hope was running out. Margaret thought she was building a shelter. But God was building something deeper: faith, resilience, and a future that grief could not steal. Because that's how it often happens in everyday life, too. The storm doesn't always look like snow. Sometimes it's bills piling up, loneliness creeping in at night, heartbreak that won't let go, or fear that whispers, "You won't make it." But even then, God still sends warmth in unexpected ways. Through a small idea, a second chance, a kind person, or the courage to take one more step when you feel finished. So if you're in a hard season right now, remember this. You don't have to have perfect resources to survive. You just need a willing heart, steady hands, and faith that God can turn what looks like not enough into more than enough. Sometimes the miracle isn't lightning from the sky. It's the strength to keep going until morning. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what storm have you survived that made you stronger? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your home, warm your heart in cold seasons, and guide you into brighter days. Amen.